It's on a 10-second delay, so yeah, no.
Okay.
So it'll still be going, but
So you're going to tell me when?
you can now.
Right now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm going to introduce Dr. Benjamin Carter. He's an assistant professor of anthropology at Muhlenberg College. He has a PhD in anthropological sciences from Washington University at St. Louis. His work looks at the intricate ways in which communities are constructed, connected, and how their identities are both formed and expressed. His dissertation focused on shell bead production and explored the development of bead makers' identities within their communities. He is currently engaged in two compelling projects. The first investigates landscapes of late prehistoric Ecuador, examining the Huancavilcas people and how the Huancavilcas people were shaped by their environment to forge a unique local identity. The second project looks at the Blue Mountain landscape in eastern Pennsylvania. While it appears natural today, it was hugely shaped by the industrial efforts of the 19th century. Dr. Carter is also very committed to openness, which you're going to see today in archaeology. He's working with open tools and standards to create a publicly accessible database that safeguards vital information while promoting shared knowledge. And so I'm so happy to have you here. Thank you very much, and you can take it away.
Thank you, Stephanie. All right. So Stephanie did such a wonderful job introducing me that my first slide was an introductory slide.
I'll still do it.
Yeah, my initial research is in shell beads, specifically on spondylus, which is this bright orange and purple and red shell here on the coast of Ecuador. And I've gotten a long way away from that, but I have two pictures up here of students because one of the reasons in which I'm no longer working anywhere near as much in Ecuador or in South America is because it's difficult to take students. As a matter of fact, it basically became impossible. And the projects that Stephanie mentioned have kind of largely fallen apart, partially because of COVID. So I want to stress that ever since I've been working at Muhlenberg, which is, I guess it's close to 15 years now, I've been trying to get students into the field. I believe that if you're going to do archaeology, if you're going to teach archaeology, that students have to actually do it. So you can see here, there's some students with me at a field school up in Maine. I worked on the Maine coast for a little while. But since then, I've developed a project that's local. And so I'm going to talk about openness, and that's a central part of this, but I wanted to stress that the openness is central to my teaching, to my research, and to the ways in which I organize the classes I teach. Not just the teaching, but the ways in which the classes are set up in our anthropology major. So the discussion today is about openness. So I thought I should start off with something basic, but in this sense, open, we all know what open is, right? You can open a box, right? There's lots of definitions of open. But what I want to talk about is a particular variant, and I want to stress that this openness means that it's freely available to anyone. Now, notice I have a little asterisk there that anyone means that anyone who has certain hardware, computers, access to the internet. I mean, most of this is based upon the idea that everybody has access to the internet, and we know that that's not true. So when I say anyone, that's not truly anyone. But the idea is that this material, we'll talk about data, we'll talk about software, et cetera, but that this is, you can view it, you can inspect it, and you can reuse and adapt it. So it's not just getting stuff out there. The idea is that stuff's out there and can be reused. And that's a central component of the sort of ethics of doing this, doing openness. And I also want to stress that, at least for me, it's about an ecosystem. I've been trying to do this for a very long time, and part of what I want to talk about today is the journey. And I started trying to do this piecemeal, and that's perfectly fine. You can do little pieces at a time. As a matter of fact, probably everybody's going to do that. But what I've been able to develop over the long term is an ecosystem where all these different open components reinforce and support each other.
So we'll start with, I'll talk a little bit about open access data. We'll talk about open access software, open source software, all the way from the basic stuff that everybody uses, word processing,
Some crazy tools that I use
for data collection.
Many of those tools you probably won't use yourself, but there's all, the point there is that there's actually all kinds of different tools out there, and so everybody can find appropriate ones for themselves. One of the things that many people have to do, all of us have to do, libraries certainly have to do, is organize data. And so I've tried to use as many open source pieces of software that I can to organize my data as well, and I'll show you some of those. And then, of course, data analysis, and then finally the publication piece, right? You've done this research, you've got these results, how do you share them and who do you share them with? The traditional model of publishing, at least for in academia, of publishing in journals is fine. I'm not going to badmouth it, but that limits who has access, because these journal articles, there's a story out there that most journal articles get cited like once or something, right? Like that's really low. And so part of the idea is opening up who has access to these. And I'll stress that that's really important to me, especially my work in South America. By publishing in open ways, my Latin American colleagues have access to it when they wouldn't normally. I mean, even the best journals, they often don't have access to. Okay, the big universities do, but a lot of my friends and colleagues who are archaeologists are outside of those, and so they have no access. And now, because I publish openly, they do. So I want to talk a little bit, I'm going to be very brief about this, about why openness is important. And to me, one of the main benefits is the cost. Okay, I started doing this when I got out of grad school. I had no money. I had a new family, and I needed to figure out how to collect my data, analyze my data, et cetera, without spending a penny. Since this is being recorded, I won't admit to starting off after grad school with pirating anything. I didn't do that. But I tried, right, to start using tools that were openly available. It didn't always work. So I want to stress that money is important here. And I want to stress that it's not so much about how much a piece of software costs, but the accessibility of that software. If it costs $50, you're not going to try it, right? Or I'm not going to try it, right? That's not a very expensive piece of software. Spending $50 to do some of your research probably is reasonable. But what I do a lot with open software is experiment, right? You sort of download something, you try it a couple times, and then the vast majority of the time discard it. Right, so I can do that because it's open, not because copyrighted and protected software. Sometimes you can do that, right? You get the free version, and then you get suckered in, and then you have to pay for the expensive one. So I can do all sorts of experimentation that I wouldn't be able to do if they were paid. The thing I want to stress there too is I'm also training my students on these open pieces of software. That has two benefits. It has an important benefit of they're free, right? But it also, they're being trained in such a way that they're not being trained to the software. They're being trained to the ideas behind the software. So if they go out and get a job and there's a commercial piece of software that's being used that does the same thing, they already have the concepts. Yeah, they might not know exactly where the buttons are, right? But they're smart, they can figure that out. Okay, but they know basically how it works, okay? They also can experiment with all of these tools, right? They can download them and check them out and discard them or use them. One of the key benefits for me is that many of these, not all of them, are cross-platform, right? They're often designed from the beginning to be that way. And many of them are actually designed to be Linux, and then there are branches, right, that are Mac and PC. There are a few that I've had issues with, mostly on Macs. Macs like to protect their ecosystem, and they don't like open software. PCs I've never had a real issue. But that also means that, again, I can use these with my students. The vast majority of my students have Macs. As faculty, we're mostly PC-based. But I can use the same piece of hardware at the same time. It also, the publication part especially, supports public engagement and enhances reliability. Even just when I tell people that they can go find my data, right, in a public talk, they're like, oh, okay. They know it's out there. Do they ever go and look at it? Honestly, I don't know, but I kind of doubt it, right? But just knowing that it exists out there gives them a little bit more faith in what you're talking about. It also, for my students, stresses who is this work for? What the data that you're producing does it just end up on your hard drive and just stay there and you maybe publish a journal article? No, right? It's out there, it's for all of us, right? You've done this research and yeah, I sort of hold on to it for a little while, right? Until I've produced, some articles and that sort of stuff. But once I'm done with it, which you're never really done with it, but then it goes out for everybody. And lots of people can use it. And I'll give you some examples of that. And of course, in academia right now, replicability and reusability are really important. There's, whether it's justified or not, there's increasing strain on the support behind academic research. And so the more your research is replicable, the more other scholars and other folks can rely upon that data. And the other thing is it's reusable, right? So I'll give you an example of how some of my colleagues have reused some of my data in ways that I didn't expect, which is also really exciting. And the last thing I'll say about this free and open ecosystem is that especially for the software, open source software is software where you can see the code. So anybody who knows code, which I don't, so I don't tend to look at this stuff, but anybody who knows code then can go and adapt it or just see what's going on, right? Like some of the commercial software is kind of a black box, right? You sort of do these things and it does stuff for you and you don't actually know what the code is telling it to do. With open source software, you can see all of that. So for computer science folks, this is really important and they can go in and even just tweak a few things, make it more efficient or make it, make the equation slightly different so it does something that they want it to do versus what it was originally programmed for. Okay, so that's the general stuff. I'm going to transition now to a story. We're going to talk about charcoal. I know, it's a rough transition. When I first moved into the Lehigh Valley, I went hiking up the Lehigh Water Gap, right? So have you all hiked up there? Okay, it's, half an hour north or so? What I started noticing was all these flat areas, and I thought, this is really cool, there's all these places you can camp. It turns out they're not for camping. They're actually for making charcoal. And I thought, hey, that's really interesting. And so I wanted to learn a little bit more, like what do you mean they're flat spaces for making charcoal? I didn't understand what that meant. So we're going to do a very quick overview of how you make charcoal. It becomes important later on. I know you were dying to learn how to make charcoal today, but so basically out in the woods you make a flat area, round, roughly 30 to 40 meters, 30 to 40 feet across. You make a big pile of wood, nice and tightly packed. You cover that with leaves and dirt. And then you let it char for, you light it, and then you let it char for 10 to 14 days. And what this does is it produces charcoal, right? So iron furnaces, which this area is well known for its iron furnaces, prior to the discovery of coal, and even long after the discovery of coal, charcoal was used to fire iron furnaces. So that's the primary use of it. And okay, so there's one more slide, and then once it's all cooked down, you rake it out. Now, what I wanted to do, okay, that's cool. right? And I wanted to know, okay, I've seen all of these flat areas around. How do I find out more about these? So, of course, I went to look for some open data. And there's, you all probably heard of LiDAR. It's really famous at the moment for identifying new sites, especially in the Maya area. Basically what it is a plane flies over a landscape, sprays the landscape with lasers. The lasers hit the ground, bounce back, and the distance is measured so you know exactly where the ground is. I'm hyper-simplifying this, right? But that's the idea. And there's a huge amount of computation that goes on and everything gets adjusted, et cetera. But point is, we get a super high resolution image of the ground, okay? And so that super high resolution image of the ground is what helps us. By the way, just in case everybody's interested, these are the two sources where I get my LiDAR data. The first one is hard for a novice to use. The second one is not. This is relatively new, so if you want to see LiDAR data yourself, like of the campus or of your backyard, you can go see it. Okay. So let me show you what this looks like. So this is a landscape on the mountain, and you can see these round circles. Right. One here, up there. Those are the remnants of charcoal hearts. Okay, so the landscape is dotted with these things. Remember, right, like I haven't spent anything, right? All I've been doing is looking at open data, and I've already started to identify these things all across the landscape. And so this just shows you, this is a profile, and you can see where they're flat, there and there, right, here and here. So they're on a slope, you get these little flat round areas. Once you start seeing them out there, you see them everywhere, okay? So what I needed to do was organize this data. And so I started identifying them, but like, what do you do? We put little points on Google Maps. What do you do? So I started using QGIS. Now, QGIS is a piece of software that's geographical information systems. Basically, that's layering a whole bunch of different kinds of maps together. So you can see here, using the LiDAR, just north of here along the Blue Mountain, I was able to identify 800 charcoal hearths. Okay, so that's, to me, right, the open data and the open tools have now allowed me to see something that you couldn't see otherwise, and I haven't spent a cent. Okay, this, by the way, at this point in time, this is not a project. This is just me being curious what the heck is going on with these things. Well, that's not true. I had students help me with those 800. I didn't identify them all. So, and up here I have a couple of tools listed. QGIS is probably the most famous. One of the things I'll say later on is don't use any open source software that's not well supported. QGIS is probably the best supported open source software out there. So this is something that people worry about, and rightly so, right? Like if you're using commercial software, you can call up the company, be on hold for a long time, maybe not get anybody. No, get a response, ask a question, get a response. Okay. With open source software, you can't do that. Okay. The great thing about QGIS in particular, and there's a number of others that are like this as well, a support ecosystem has actually developed around that. So you can actually pay for support. Okay. Now, you may not need it, but just so you know, it's out there, right? If you're worried about adopting it, right, that support can be gotten. And the other two tools, the PostGIS and the PG Admin, are for advanced folks, right? PostGIS is a type of database, it's a relational database, and PG Admin is a way in which you can manage that. I'll leave it at that. So I got to thinking and talking to one of my colleagues, like, okay, we have some interesting data here, what do we do with this? And of course, he's a computer guy, so he says, well, let's use machine learning to look across all of Pennsylvania. And I said, go ahead. I can't do that. So I won't go into the details of what mask RCNN is, mostly because I don't really know them very well. He does. But I want to point out that this is also a free and open source piece of software, right? If you're going to use it, this one, you have to know how to code. He does, I don't. But using that, we were able to come up with this map. So this map shows you 26,000 relic charcoal hearths across Pennsylvania. Okay, so that's something that people knew. By the way, people knew these charcoal hearths existed everywhere. But what we've shown them is exactly where. Okay, and you can see there's some very clear patterns. There's not a lot, especially in north central Pennsylvania. Okay, there's very little up there. And so what we did with that project, I mean, this is the biggest thing out of that project. What we did then was publish it. So we published an article, and I will point out that it was published in a journal. It's called the Advances in Archaeological Practice. We specifically chose that because they have a relatively inexpensive open option. So we did have to pay for that. It was, if I remember right, it was a few $100s. It wasn't that bad. Okay. Other journals are way more expensive, right? Just to publish openly. Okay. So we chose that actually before we even started the project. We were like, okay, we're going to do this. Before we even do it, where are we going to publish it? And that way we could sort of customize things so that we knew knew how to sort of get appropriate results for the right audiences. We also published the data. So all of the data that we used is all online. You can go download this. All those 26,000 points, you can go find out exactly where all of them are. And then we also, the last two things are very, very detailed descriptions of our methods. And notice that those are published in a journal called the Journal of Open Archaeology. Once again, there are journals out there. Now this is a small, not particularly well-known one, and this is the sole purpose of it, is to sort of publish supporting materials. Okay? But there's lots out there. Okay? Do they have a high impact factor? Nope. But sometimes the impact factor is not what it's about. It's about getting the information out there. So this journal article was published openly. A number of my other articles I've published openly, and I want to show you some of the benefits specifically for faculty, right? Especially people who are facing promotion or tenure. There are numbers that you can get from open publication that you can't get if if an article is in a protected space. So here, and these are all from different places. These are from my sites on ResearchNet and the ResearchGate.net in the upper left. That one, notice the article's on there, right? If I published openly, I can also put the articles in my space too, right? It's not just in the journal, okay? So you can see this one, right? You can see that particular article has had 351 reads, okay? Now what are reads? Well, that's a good question. It's some information, it tells us something. If you look at over here, this is actually the journal, their data, right? So that there, it's had 841 views, and 706 people have viewed the PDFs, okay? All of this sort of data can be used for tenure files, right? It also, and maybe I shouldn't stress that, it's not really about promotion and tenure, right? But it's about understanding what impact your own work has, right? Those numbers mean something to me rather than just publishing an article and just, it's out there in the ether and you don't know much, okay? And I'll also point out, right, these two, and there are ethical issues with both of these. I still use them. Are they truly open? No, but they are mechanisms in which I can get my material out there. And I want to stress that for me, they're particularly important because a number of the articles that I've published are not the one I was just talking about, but a number of articles that I published previously are about South America. And how do I know if my South American colleagues are getting any of this information? Previously, I had no idea. Okay? Now at least I have some idea. Exactly, interpreting those numbers gets a little complicated, but at least I have a better idea of where it's being used. Notice it's being downloaded the most in the US, but then second in Peru and Ecuador. just that right there is one of the most important pieces of data. The numbers themselves aren't necessarily important. And I don't know how many people might have a Google Scholar profile set up. This has become more and more important for me. And you can see that this is the article that I was just talking about. And it's got 11 citations already, which depends upon what you think. But 11's not too bad when it was just published a few years ago. Okay. So there's also data that you can get from open publication of your data. You can see I publish almost exclusively on a website, an archive called Zenodo. Zenodo is really important. It is based at CERN, which is that great big huge particle collider that crosses, I think it's the French and Swiss border. And what's important here is that they use these massive banks of computers to analyze their data, but they have some spare space. And so they provide that spare space for anyone, and I should say any academic, to store their data. Okay? So when I hope this doesn't when COVID was happening, you could get all the most recent data on Zenodo, the real data, right? The actual data rather than somebody's interpretation of it. And so this became a really important source. And so it's still, all the COVID data is up there. I shouldn't say all. Of course, people have to voluntarily put it up there, but a lot of people were, because they saw it as really important and really important to get that information out to everybody. And so you can see that some of the work on here, this one right here, describes the process. And you can see it's been seen 387 times and downloaded 196 times. The interesting thing there that I want to point out is that one of those, some of those numbers are a colleague of mine who's downloading the data and the description and using it in his GIS class. So again, a use that I wasn't necessarily expecting. Okay, so there are just some numbers up there, but at least some of those numbers I know that it's actually being used in classrooms. Other people are just checking it out, interested. This, the one at the top, that's actual data, right? These are descriptions, and that's data. So that was downloaded, the actual data is downloaded 79 times, so that's I think pretty good. So we have all these charcoal hearths, and I thought, well, we've identified them in LiDAR, we probably should take a look at them in the field. So all of that stuff that I have on my computer in QGIS, this GIS package, I then put in QField, which is basically this, it's the same thing, but it's on a tablet. So Sarah here in the middle, she's got a small little tablet in her hand, and she has full-fledged GIS in her hand. She has the map that she's holding literally has, I think it's like 50 different layers. And so she can see historical maps, she can see LiDAR maps, she can see 3 or 4 different versions of modern maps, she can see historic aerial photos, all while she's out there, okay, or all while they're out there. So this is them, and they're focused here on the LiDAR, and they're going out all those charcoal hearths that we identified using mask RCNN. We are now confirming them in the field. And I'll note that we're at about 98% accuracy. So that mask RCNN actually works really well. Okay. So all of this has led the project to, in many ways, a different space. And so what we're doing now, and I know this may seem like a big shift, but we're still working on charcoal. But what it has become is we're working with the descendants of black communities who lived in the middle of these charcoal fields. So you can see here in this map, all the circles, the blue and green, those are all charcoal hearths. The green ones, by the way, are ones that my students have walked to and confirmed that they are in fact charcoal hearths. The blue ones we haven't checked yet. These diagrams here, this is what a community called Sixpenny Creek. And so this was occupied by a black community from around 1842 through, the descendants, some of the descendants still live there, so technically through now, but largely it had been mostly depopulated by 1900. And what the argument has become is that these communities were an active component of the Underground Railroad prior to the Civil War. And again, right, this is using the LiDAR data, it's using open books, it's using open maps, right? Almost all the maps that we use are coming from the Library of Congress. We download them, we geo-rectify them and put them into our GIS, and we take them out in our field in Q field. So you're actually out in the field walking through a historic map. So what I want to point out here is that all of this would not have been I won't say it wouldn't have been possible. It's vastly more possible for myself as sort of starting this off, as building it. Every time I added a sort of level in this, I added new software, and all of it has been open source software. Publishing my data has developed new communications with other colleagues, and so it has been able to expand this project. This is a diagram of the land ownership there. It was originally purchased by Jehu and Dinah Nixon, and they proceeded to sell it off to other black families. And the diagram here is made in Wide Graph Editor, which I love, but I also do want to point out that this is one of the few that it's free, but it's not open source. Okay, so you can use it, I use it, but you can't see the actual code. Okay, so there are many things out there like that. I try to avoid them, right? I try to stay as open as I can, but sometimes it works, and so you use it. And so I also want to stress that I try to publish publicly as well. So this is an article, a short article that I published in the newsletter of the Pennsylvania Parks and Forestry Foundation, which seems like a sort of a silly place, or I won't say silly, an unusual place for an academic to publish. But it has turned out, I did it because they actually asked me to, and I was like, this sounds great, I would love to. But it has turned out as a huge benefit because they actually set it up so that I could make copies and bring it wherever I go. So this right here, now I had to print them, that's not free. But I've probably handed out 200 copies of this. Okay, so that's another, but I wouldn't necessarily be able to do that. I guess I could do that with journal articles, but it would be a lot more pages. The final thing that I want to mention is that I've also got a wiki. And so this is another way in which but also my students are publishing openly. So it's on Sixpenny Creek. It's at wiki.sixpennycreek.org. And you can sort of go and see, but the key here is that my students can sign up, and just like Wikipedia, they can edit it. Okay, so a lot of the information and material on this website was actually, the vast majority of it was put up there by my students. Okay, now a lot of maybe the work behind it had a lot to do with me, but actually putting it up there is the students. Okay, and so another way in which the information is getting out there. I'm actually part of an email list about making charcoal. I know, you're amazed that there's an email list for making charcoal. There is, by the way, there is, and it's the Hopewell Furnace Collier group. So the Colliers are the charcoal makers, and they make charcoal at Hopewell Furnace twice a year. It's actually really amazing to see. So, but I'm on their email list, and it was so gratifying when somebody shared, like, hey guys, I found this really great new website. And it happened to be my website. It happened to be this. right? And so at least I know somebody's out there watching. Oh, the other thing, I didn't put a slide in here. All of these websites, you can track who visits and when, right? And so I actually do that. I didn't put any images up here, so I know when the website's getting some use and sometimes where that use is coming from, et cetera. So I've also want to sort of wrap up with some deep concerns with my own openness. It's been a long journey. I think up until just a few years ago, I was all open all the time, and I thought that was the answer. It's not, or it's not always. So there has to be a balance, right, between the intellectual property rights of scholars. That's a real thing. We put a lot of time and effort into this, and so the intellectual property rights of scholars are important. But when you're working with minoritized communities, it's very important that they have say over what happens with their data. You don't just get to sort of work with them and then publish whatever, put their data, right? And it is their data out there for everyone to see, okay? And so at this point, right, I mentioned that I'm working with a descendant community at Sixpenny Creek, and so they have say in what gets put out there in the open, okay? So it's still all about openness, but they get to decide, right, rather than me. I'm an external force who's helping them work on understanding the community that they're descended from, but I'm not sort of the ownership. I don't have ownership of that data. And by the way, that relationship is very productive in the sense that they know that I won't put anything out there. That means they sort of have more faith in the work that I'm doing and that they have a say in what does and doesn't go out. Okay? And so that allows me to do this work. I think if I just came in and, as too many academics do, come in and sort of take people's data, publish it, and then not even send it back to them or even tell them what you've discovered, right? That's all too common, okay? What that does is it actually creates a situation in which communities don't want to be studied because they don't get anything out of it. This is true especially of indigenous communities and especially in this country, where indigenous communities have been studied and studied and studied, and they get nothing back from it, okay? So I want to stress that there are situations in which this is not necessarily, this sort of full openness that I've been stressing is not necessarily the answer. I do want to stress that there's a couple different ways to think about protecting data. One is obfuscation. And essentially you can change your data in slight and predictable ways such that your data is still useful, but it's not, it doesn't have the precision. Let me give you an example. I collect data on a lot of points. They have GPS locations. If somebody has that GPS location, they can put it in their phone and walk to that point, right? Well, that's fine for charcoal hearths, to be honest with you. People are like, okay, now I'm on a charcoal hearth. Now I'm gonna go away, I'm done. Nobody's going to dig it up, okay? At least I don't think so. But let's say you have a Native American site from 5,000 years ago. You don't want to share that location, okay? But what you can do is, in a systematic way, you can change that location just a little bit, right? So that it's still useful to scholars, but you can't actually go out and walk to that particular location, okay? And I'll also show you a couple of examples of ways in which communities have control over their data. And they're models that I'm not to this point yet, but they're models that I'm basing my work upon. One is this great project. It's called the Texas Freedom Colonies. This is put together by Andrea Roberts from the University of Virginia. It's spectacular. Essentially what it is, it's a big map, and it's a map of post-emancipation communities, African-American communities in Texas. And it's all web-based, collecting data, and I want to stress that that's really important because many of these communities are diasporic in the sense that actually many of these communities don't have any descendants still living in the communities, but they often have a connection. And so if they're living in, I don't know, California, right, they can still participate in this. They can contribute, right? So members of the community can contribute all sorts of photos, of course, are one of the most important, but also stories about different places in these communities. But they also get to decide who to share with and how. Okay, so some of the data goes into the system and never comes out on the public side. Okay, and that's one way in which some of the data can be shared, right, especially between community members, right, and they can see each other's stuff, but the public can't necessarily see them. The other example is a really cool project called Mukutu. It's always hard for me because you don't pronounce the R. Mukutu. And this project was designed by Australian Aboriginal groups in order to protect their own cultural heritage while still being able to share when appropriate. So what they've done is built this system, and again, you can sort of contribute all sorts of stuff, but then there are all sorts of cultural protocols, right? Protocols that the group has decided upon of when and how things can be shared with the outside. So there might be times of the year that certain things don't appear in their database. They're out there, but they don't appear because for one reason or another, culturally, that's not appropriate, okay? It also, one of the coolest things I think about it is that many of the objects are understood differently. Objects being photos or photos of objects, et cetera, even videos, right? They're understood differently by different people. And so this is one of the things that was built into this was different ways of understanding. And so you can still see all of that as well. And so those are, for me, my next hope is to try to use this, the Mukutu, for the current project. Still in conversation with the descendants. It takes time. So I'll end with just a few last suggestions. I think I mentioned this before. Only use stuff that's really well supported. This is key. There are a few things out there that I've used and they weren't well supported. And if they break or something doesn't work, you're done, okay? Unless you know how to code or something, okay? QGIS is one that's super well supported. LibreOffice, right? Especially this is a good one for students, right? If you don't have Microsoft Office, right? LibreOffice is the whole Office suite, but open source, okay? And that one's really well supported. Also, find communities. So I was really lucky. I applied for a number of institutes and workshops, and a lot of what you're hearing today came from these. I'll particularly stress the NEH Institute that I went to in 2022 about Black and Indigenous landscapes. Really has a huge impact on thinking about ways in which I can share, or should share, or need to think about sharing information about landscapes throughout Pennsylvania associated both with Indigenous communities and with the Black communities that I'm currently working with. And that's where I'll wrap it up and ask you, what are you wondering about? I don't know if there's anybody online who has questions or folks in the room.
We were talking earlier about data management systems. Do you have any
So,
open source?
in what type of data?
That's a great, both, either, any, or.
So some of it is like if you have a simple like spreadsheet sort of thing, right? Like that LibreOffice has great tools. LibreOffice also so it's called LibreOffice Calc. That's like the Excel equivalent, and then they also have, I'm not remembering it. They have a database, so you can do more complicated things in the database. That's like Microsoft Access, if you've ever used that. Then there's other, like the PostGIS and the PGAdmin and the QGIS, that's all for managing spatial databases. So if you have those would be useful. Do those sound like?
Those sound lovely.
Okay.
Anything that's free is lovely.
Well, one of the problems is there's so many different types of data, right? If you have well-structured data, you know, even something simple like a spreadsheet sometimes is the easiest thing. It just works well.
Oh, spreadsheet.
A good spreadsheet is great. If you get really complicated data, get out of the spreadsheet.
Excel solves most, but not all. Well, I guess now it's LibreCalc, you were saying.
Well, and I don't know how many people know, but they all have pivot tables. Do you use pivot tables?
I have used pivot tables in the past.
They're the best, right? If you want summaries of your data, don't do like average and do the calculations, use the pivot tables. And they, you know, I mean, Google Sheets has this, Excel has it, but so does LibreOffice Calc.
So can I ask about how integrating the open data and tools into your curriculum has transformed learning experience for your students?
So that's a great question. So there's a little article out there that my colleagues and I wrote about a tool called Kobo Toolbox. And what we discovered, so the Kobo Toolbox is like a field collection tool, and it's created by Harvard, and it's largely used by the UN to collect data in, let's we'll call it difficult conditions. You know, in situations in which, you're not going to have Wi-Fi and, you know, very difficult conditions. So it's a very durable data collection tool. So what I had my students do is actually, I designed the tool, right? Like you can change all sorts of things around. Think Google Forms, right? And one of the things that we discovered was that things weren't working quite right. And so in conversation with my students, we moved things around and readjusted things so that we were collecting better data. Now, that's a conversation that's really hard to have with students if the software is commercial and closed, right? They can all log on and see everything that I can see, okay? So we can have a conversation. Now, that's not a conversation that I actually had with students before about ways in which you structure data collection. But what I found is that that made them vastly better at collecting data, right? So the data that I got coming out of this was really good data. Not that it wasn't good before, but sometimes there's just like, they didn't quite know what they should push or select, and so there's some errors. This created much cleaner data, but it also meant that they really understood what they were doing. And so as a teaching tool, because that Kobo Toolbox was open, it allowed me to teach this lesson I honestly wasn't even really expecting to do. But it was really valuable both for me, from a pedagogical perspective, of like, I was just asking them to collect data, like how hard is it? I mean, it is hard, right? But this actually made them co-creators of the ways in which we were collecting data. And like QGIS, right, this GIS software, I've got all my students using it. There's a learning curve, and so some of them are sometimes a little frustrated with it. But that's true for any GIS software, and this one is free.
And is there a benefit, so they leave the school and they don't have access to all the libraries, databases, and the software that comes with the academic experience, and so I'm guessing that this is all really good to know.
Right.
They're not going to.
To me, that's key. If I didn't stress that enough, I'll double stress it, right? Like every tool that I use with my students, they can then turn around and use themselves. That means, that they can, do some of this stuff on their own if they wanted to, but it also means that they can tell employers that they can design data collection forms. Right? These are skills that you don't necessarily develop in just any any class, or in some ways, I wasn't necessarily expecting to develop those, but because the software was open, they can, and now they can tell potential employers that they can do this, and this is not a skill that many undergraduates have. So if being able to use these tools, they can, I tell my students, like, talk about these things with potential employers. I think they're really valuable, and they will hopefully see the value of that. Even if they use commercial tools, they've used something that's similar, and so they can just, with a click or two, sort of move over to a different system. Okay, sometimes it's a little harder than a click or two, but at least they've got the concepts down. And so then learning exactly where the clicks are is much easier. Sure.
Sorry, you mentioned earlier that using this open source helped your students become co-creators. And I was wondering if open sourced tools in general was shifting power dynamics between you and your students, or between you and just, I wanted to, I had a whole sentence. It's gone.
No. I think it's about the relationship between, so I think it has changed my relationship to my students, because with many of the tools that I had been using previously, they were too difficult. They were sort of closed in, but also complicated, and 5,000 different options. In particular with COBOL Toolbox, it's designed so that anybody can design a form. And that sort of helped make them co-creators, but also the collecting the data in the field using these digital tools helps them think about ways in which we can change, right? So it's not just about sort of being able to make a form. That actually sounds kind of simple. It's not. It's very complicated. But being in the field and collecting the data that then feeds directly into a database that is being then published out there, right? They're not just co-creators in a project. They're co-creators in data that is ending up in the real world, right? And I think that's true of the data collection, but I also think that's perhaps even more true of the wikis, right? The wikis, the students are largely the creators. Like I do some editing, and every now and then when I get some time, I want to add something, so I do. But it's really their work. And so they have published works. And again, I tell them, talk about this with potential employers and point out, like, hey, I designed this page, right? It's all laid out, it's got great information, it's all cited, right? I think that's a skill that's worth talking about with employers. I guess depending upon what you're going to do. But.
So there's not a question online, but there is praise online.
Okay.
So it's from
I'll
the
take it.
library. So it's from the library director at Muhlenberg, so Tina Hotel, and she said thank you to me for having an online option, and then she said Dr. Carter is a wonderful colleague, and students really enjoy the ways he engages with them and has them considering open scholarship and so much more.
Guess I'll take it. Thanks, Tina. And I'll say that the more I do this, the more I learn. I feel like I shouldn't be learning this, but the more I learn the importance of librarians.
Thank you.
Right. It's like this is actually librarians in many ways. Over at Muhlenberg, Tim Clark in the library has become one of my main partners in this. Partially because he knows the GIS end of it, and he's actually the one teaching our GIS class. But whenever I have questions about a new open source piece of software, I asked him, right? Yeah.
Do you have favorites that are kind of outside of spatial data collection?
It's a good question.
This is Zotero.
Oh, yes. So I'm being prompted here. No, Zotero, right? Which I did mention. I didn't mention in the presentation, it blows my mind that I didn't mention it, because Zotero is a central component of every single day. Right? I use it every single day. So for those of you who don't know, Zotero is it's open source, but it's web-based, and so it's a web-based bibliography manager. I probably have at least 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 citations built in there. And for the students, right, who don't like formatting bibliographies, it's ideal because once it's in there, right, you just click MLA or APA or Chicago. You should always be clicking Chicago. I don't play favorites. You just click it and it gives you the right format, right? You don't have to worry about where the periods are or which one gets italicized or underlined or bold, etc. It's great.
Do you have other tools outside of
So,
like
I was gonna say I shared a list. Is there anything on the list that I didn't mention? Because I tried to.
Why?
I'm curious, what was your first open source?
Oh, what was my first open source?
And what led you down that path of looking for open source?
And so now that I'm looking at the list, I'll stress two tools. One is Inkscape. So Inkscape is an open source, well, it's the open source version of Adobe Illustrator, right? And so back when I was making illustrations for my dissertation, right, I couldn't afford Illustrator, right? Inkscape came to the rescue. And by the way, I'll stress that like only use stuff that's well supported. Inkscape is one of those. And the other one is GIMP. So GIMP is an image editor, right? Think Photoshop, okay? Free, open, right? It's a, you know, I mean, we all have to deal with photos at some point. This is just a free tool, and it's, you know, I mean, many computers come with at least some image editing capabilities, right? So there's some built in. This is so much, you can do all sorts of stuff that you can't do on those basic image editors.
Talk about Transcribus.
Oh, Transcribus is really cool. So Transcribus is based upon machine learning, and it transcribes, so it's wild. One of the things that I did, and I didn't talk much about it, see the plots here, these polygons, those are directly from the historic deeds. So I went into the historic deeds and it says, you know, from this point, go this direction at this angle, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It comes sort of back around and it sort of encloses the piece of land that's included in that deed. Well, they're exhausting to read, right? So essentially what I did was I put them all into Transcribus, it transcribed them, and then I could just read it in, you know, I could change the font and do whatever I wanted with it, okay?
Does it work in multiple languages or just English?
It actually is in multiple languages.
Nice.
So I think it actually started in France. So it's, I don't know how many languages, but it definitely could do multiple. And I don't understand the machine learning piece, right? I kind of get the concept, but it's amazing. Like the deeds that I was putting in, it wasn't like they were written all by the same person or something. They're all different handwriting. And so it uses databases that exist outside of what I was using, right, that have all sorts of different handwriting, and uses those to compare, and I was amazed at how accurate it was. It was actually kind of jaw-breaking. Of course, there were some errors, right? I mean, you know, when we write, we often tail off, right, and some of those, you miss a letter or two, but boy, it was pretty darn good. And that's all free and open source.
We don't have any questions or comments online, but Tina said thank you for shouting out Tim.
Any other questions? Well, it is on the hour, so I guess that is a good place to stop if no one has any more questions.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
You're welcome.
It's so wonderful.
Thank you to
Thank
the
you so much.
audience, all of you.
It's really great, thank you.
You're very welcome. Very welcome. Thank you all for coming, seriously.
We had a max number of 8 people online,
Oh,
so
that's-
our online audience,
You
thank you
stopped
so
it?
much. I was gonna say thank you to the audience.